Hi, everyone. I'm Angela Lynn.
And I'm Jesse Lynn. Welcome back to another episode of But Where Are You Really From?
Today, our episode topic name is Hindsight is 2030. And basically, this topic is around how now that we're in our 30s, we have time to reflect. We do a lot of introspection, I feel like, especially on this show. So we were kind of pondering this thought of where we are now in our 30s, looking back in our 20s. Are there big life decisions that we made in our 20s that we question? Like, were they the right choices? So for me now, thinking about what I want to do left with my current life path, a lot of it has to do with family planning, especially around this concept of, did society dictate this decision for me, or is this actually a decision I made for myself with my own like values, with my own thinking about my future and all that? And it's a little bit hard to pick apart because basically I feel like in my 20s, especially living in New York, I kind of saw what was around me as a whole world of other young professionals who put their career first, and especially other women, right? And in your 20s, at least in that New York bubble, I know it's different if you live in different parts of the country, but especially big metropolitan cities like New York, I think it's pretty common for young professionals of both genders to kind of put themselves first, work advancement first, me first, and not necessarily want to do things like settle down. And so when I think about the topic of children, like for sure, my 20s, that was the furthest thing I wanted in my life. I was like, this sounds terrible. Like, if I got pregnant, it would be the worst thing ever. And so I had only negative things around this idea of getting pregnant. But now in my 30s, I think I took for granted that youth. I mean, there's obviously like a physical aspect and a mental aspect. Like, was I mentally ready to have kids in my 20s? Probably not, especially since I was not in a committed relationship yet. But had I known then how hard it would be to get pregnant now in my 30s, I think maybe that would have influenced my mindset of like how early I would have been ready to settle down, because I think when you're young, you really take for granted your youth. You're like, I'm going to be young forever. And like, we've talked about this, but when we're under 30, right, even thinking about hitting the 30 milestone, I was like, oh, I'm still young if I'm not 30 yet. you know, like 30 is like when you start getting old. I mean, it's not like we're ancient now, but it has a big biological impact, especially on women. So, yeah, it's just something I've been pondering a lot now, is like, it's something I struggle with now that I want to have children. It's not happening as fast as I thought. Like, I think in our 20s, especially women, I don't know why, it's just this like myth that anytime you have sex, like you could get pregnant. Sure, it's a more than zero chance that you could get pregnant, but like it only really happens during a very specific window in a very specific time of the month that you could get pregnant. And especially as you get older, it's just like harder and harder. So yeah, I don't know. That's my main thing that I'm looking back on now in my 30s and my 20s of like, should that have been a bigger priority for me in looking back, in looking towards my future?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of the societal force in these areas feels a lot to me like you have to really lean into the extremes for people to listen to you. And the extremes are not really the reality, right? So you were talking about how, like, if you get pregnant, it could be like the end of the world, the end of your career. But I feel like simultaneously, there are all these other restrictions on what success looks like at different stages. So, what I mean by that is you have the pressure that's like, if you have a child, it's the end of the world because you have to focus on the child. But then for people who have children, sometimes there's this perception of your children take away from your career, or they're distractions from you, or they like absorb a lot of your time. And if you're career oriented, professional oriented, that might reflect negatively on you. So it almost feels like all of these life decisions are so hard to make because it's like damned if you do and damned if you don't, right? Like, and it's really difficult to see how all of the choices can play out when you're surrounded by people in an environment that are largely like focused in one area. So you can't really see how someone maybe in their mid 20s having a child or a family would succeed in relation to everybody else, because you're just not that many examples of that. So yeah, I think that that can be a very challenging thing. I don't think I have regrets per se about my choices. Like, there are definitely things where I'm like, well, I probably could have done that differently, but it's not like it sits on my mind and eats me up. But obviously, like that, this is a different issue for you, particularly because it's a physiological issue that you cannot really like do anything about. But for me, I think it's just like embarking on the different journeys in my life and looking back and being like, did I really have like full agency here? Like, did I really understand what was happening? Like, even starting just like going, making the choice to go to college, I was like, I look back on it and I'm like, did I gain anything out of that? Like, it's something that everybody was doing. And there's this, you have to do it to have success, allegedly. But the more I look back on it, the more I'm like, I don't know if I learned a lot from being in college. And like, my job has nothing to do with what I learned in college. And I just feel like there's this funneling of younger people towards a certain path to success where enough of your peers follow it, where you just kind of like, this is the go with the flow, right? Like, this is the way it has to be, this is the way everyone else is doing it. And it's hard to push against that because, again, they're just like not really great examples of what else you might be doing. So I think one of the things that really impacted me early on was like, you and I both focused like heavily on our careers. And I look back on it, sometimes I like am not regretful, but like wistful for like my peers who spent their 20s like making mistakes and like partying and getting fucked up and like having different relationships. And that's kind of like the experience I'm trying to recapture now that I'm older and more tired. And it's like more difficult to do, right? Because you're like trying to have this like baby adult phase in a later adult phase, which is a little bit opposite. But that's what was presented to me. That's what was put in front of my feet. Like, this is the path that you have to walk to be successful. And if you stray from that, if you find too much freedom, personal time in your own like fun pursuits, that might derail you from being quote unquote successful and stable later on.
You've heard me complain about how weird it is to be an American-born Mandarin speaker because I grew up speaking Mandarin at home and have a passing native accent, but simultaneously sound like a child when trying to talk about real things. Since I realized no one out there was catering to people like us and decided, I'm just going to do it myself, I teamed up with my native Taiwanese Mandarin language teacher to create Real You Mandarin, a self-paced online Mandarin course built specifically for ABCs and ABTs. All of our content is video-based, realistic dialogues centered on topics you'd actually want to talk about, from dating and pop culture to media representation and growing up as a minority in a majority society. You'll learn the relevant vocabulary in the context you actually use them and be able to practice them daily with pre-built digital flashcards. You'll also be able to practice speaking by shadowing, repeating back, or following along with all of these dialogues to practice speaking at natural speed with the right pronunciations. Check out the course at realumandarin.com and get 10% off using promo code WhereAreYouFrom10. Let us help you express the real you when you speak Mandarin. Hey listeners, wondering how you can support us? The biggest way is by increasing our visibility by following us on Instagram at WhereAreYouFromPod, on TikTok at But Where Are You Really From, subscribing to our YouTube channel under But Where Are You Really From Podcast, rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, and telling your friends. The more people we can get to listen to the show, the more we can continue spotlighting different perspectives and stories. And if you feel so inclined, we're also accepting donations at buymeacoffee.com/whereareyoufrom. Thanks, y'all. I think the universal theme is that even though a lot of times what we talk about is that when you're a kid, you just want to fit in. And I think adults often downplay how much they still just want to fit in. And that includes like corporate related things, career related things, family related things, and whatever your surroundings are highly dictates what is considered normal. And that's why I said the thing about like having my young adult self grow older in New York in my 20s had a big impact on the idea of like, who wants a family right now? Why would I want a family? But if I grew up like in the South, for example, I'm sure I would have already had a family. Like everyone has families in their 20s because it's a highly religious part of the country and it's just more normal for people to start families younger. The other universal thing in hearing your reminiscences is like, I think as you get older, the thing that a lot of people come to realize is that the only thing you can't take for granted is time, because that is the only thing that is like truly finite, right? Whether that is time with your family, time with friends, your time in your life, like to do things, time in your life where you are physically healthy enough to go on all these adventures, to try different experiences. And as I've mentioned now, fertility wise, like to have family biologically, naturally, easily, like all these things you can't redo and you can't get back. Like once you've spent it, you've spent it. And that's something I've been thinking about a lot. There's no qualifier for starting a family, but for some reason I in my head was like, I can't, because I think I saw starting a family as like the end of something, because that's the way that society, and especially in those big metropolitan cities, had conditioned me to think, was like, you're done. Like you as an individual, you are done after you have a family. You're like, say goodbye to your career, say goodbye to like fun. So I think that always stayed with me. It was just like, oh, family equals the end of something, as opposed to something that's like the beginning of a whole different part of my life that can be something you want to embark on, not some like crusty old negative thing that it's painted as when you're young.
Well, that in and of itself is like another thing, right? Another like damned if you do and damned if you don't, right? So it's like, why couldn't you have a child? Obviously, like having a child means you're gonna have less time, but like, why couldn't you have a child and still retain some semblance of your life, right? I think there's this like very black and white dichotomy about what parenthood looks like, and like it's interesting because part of like what you're describing is what I felt a lot. It's just kind of like I felt a little stuck sometimes when I was dating my ex. I was like following the path, right? You know, you find a stable relationship, you settle down with this person, and you're like, this is the right thing to do according to what I feel like I see everywhere else. And then after a while, there's just like a level of complacency that comes in, and then you're just stuck there. You really had to work to find people and examples and systems of support. And it's kind of one of those things where like you just don't know what you don't know. And so I feel like for me, a lot of the challenges was like, I really had to try something out before I was like, do I really understand what this is and what it means to me? And then sometimes in the process of trying something, you just kind of get stuck there because you're like, I don't really see anywhere else to go. This seems like the best place for me to stay for a while, even though it may not feel quite right, right? Like it wasn't the magical experience that you saw on TV or like when you talk to other people where they're like, I'm so in love with my partner. I was like, I don't exactly feel this way. But every general thing says I'm doing the right thing in this relationship, keeping this relationship.
I can kind of vibe with what you're saying of like, you don't really know until you try something different. In regards to the idea of family, for me, like, we haven't seriously been starting to try for a family until like this year. But I will say, I think the emotional impact, or like when it kind of like hit me more of like, I do want to have a family, because before I always said like, I will want a family someday. So I like already knew that biologically, I just like, I needed to start thinking about it and like committing to trying at a certain point in my life if I wanted to go the natural route. But from like an emotionally hitting me standpoint, I would say it only happened very, very recently, only after we started raising our puppy, because we always joked that the puppy was going to be like baby practice. It kind of is. Like we talked about Yuki the last life update episode, but like puppies require so much work because they are literally like a baby, especially with the potty training stuff. You can't you have to pay attention to it like every few hours, especially in the beginning. I was up every 30 minutes to an hour for the first like 3 weeks of her life with us because of potty training stuff and like can't do anything without you really. And so it was a lot of work, but it also was the first time where I felt this just like unconditional love for something where I was like, I love this thing so much. And I didn't even birth it, right? It was like I don't know even how I have all this love for this little thing. And so seeing the amount of capacity I had for love for something that I didn't even birth, I think kind of triggered something in my head where I was like, oh, wow. So if I can already feel this way towards something that is not even a human, I can only imagine like the kind of fulfillment that I could feel giving love towards a human baby. So it was like the additional aspect of like the emotional click as opposed to before. It was always like a logical decision making thing of like, oh, by this time, by this age, I need to start trying because blah, blah, blah. But I never really cared that much. It was more like, I just need to if I don't want to regret it. But now I'm like, it's emotionally impacting
Hmm.
me. Yeah.
Now you're like, I'm ready to have a family for sure.
No one takes advice when you're in your 20s, but I will say, like, if you're in your 20s and you're listening to this episode, think about it a little harder. Like, I have felt more sadness around this topic than I ever would have thought I would have, but it's seriously like these last months of trying, like, it's going to impact you harder than you think when it's not as easy as you think it's going to be when you actually want the family. So think about it a little bit harder when you have it easier.
I think a huge barrier to trying things in your life that you actually want to do is just what you think other people's reactions or judgments are going to be. I would echo your advice in the same way where it's like figure out like what you think you really want to do. And like maybe you're not sure, but like make the mistake and try it and like forget about what you think other people are going to think about you for taking that step, because ultimately like if you're satisfied with what choices you're trying to make, that's all that really matters. And I feel like for both of us, like that's really what's changed, right? I think we're more certain of who we are now than we were in our 20s, but I don't think you have to be that certain to make decisions and stick to them. I think that's the only thing that I really needed to hear in my 20s is like it's okay to make decisions you want to make and make lots of mistakes. You're still going to be happier having made those mistakes because ultimately those were your choices rather than following a path where you're making right choices, but they weren't necessarily things that were like intrinsically important to you.
Echoing that, but adding on, question your own choices in terms of like, why am I making this choice? Is this something I actually care about and that I value, or is this just what everyone's doing, so I'm doing it? Because I think if you actually take the time to question yourself on a lot of those things, you might realize you don't actually know why you're doing something. You're just doing it because that's just what everyone else is doing. So it's what's normal. So I should do it too. And again, time is the only thing you cannot get back, really. So think a little harder because you might end up on a path way down the road and realize I didn't want to be on this path actually at all.
On that note, thank you, listeners, for tuning in. I have hope for the next generation. I feel like the Gen Zs are very anti everything. They're gonna do everything differently, which is great. Let us know what you think about the episode. Please give us some feedback in the comments and socials. Would love to hear from you if you are not a younger generation. If there were any things that you would do differently if you could go back in time.
And come back next week because we will have another fresh episode for you then. And until then,
Zaijian,
bitches.
bitches.